Welcome to the Historical Society and Museum for those who haven't been in here before. My name is Morgan, I'm the director of the museum, and I just want to give a really quick welcome, introduction, and then I'll hand it over to our speakers tonight. So a few quick housekeeping things. We're really excited to host this special Beers and Banter in honor of 100 years of women climbing in the Tetons, which is really exciting, and I'll let Kim describe that more. We have Kim Geil here, who's going to moderate the panel and give a short presentation on Eleanor Davis and some of the history. And then we'll turn over to our panel. That will be question and answer that Kim will lead, and then we'll turn it over to you all for question and answer. Beers and Banter, as always, brings out communities connected to the theme. So I know there are probably lots in the audience who are a part of this topic and feel connected to it, and so it's definitely a conversation, and we welcome you all to chime in and be a part of that. A few housekeeping things. The beer tonight and the drinks are a suggested donation. They directly benefit the museum, so please get up and get another drink if you need to. There are bathrooms at the back of our building and recycling by the front door. And a big thank you to JPMorgan Chase, who supports these programs, and our members and donors. And if you like what you hear tonight, please consider supporting the Historical Society in Old Bills. So with that, I think we'll pass it over to Kim. And we'll do a little sound check.
Testing. Can you hear me through the microphone yet?
No, I don't.
Is that better?
I think you have to
Hold it?
I don't know, it's gonna be close to your mouth.
Is that better? Or am I gonna get, no?
No.
I don't know.
This place works a lot here.
Oh, is it
Closer to this.
Why don't you use the other microphone that she was using?
That could be problematic if you're a little too close.
Oh, it's not, no. Every presentation. I know.
It's always something, right?
No, it's not on. It's not on.
Okay.
There. Wait, can I make two other quick plugs? We're building a new history museum where hopefully we won't have any more AV issues. So that's really exciting. If you want to learn more about that project, let me know. And also, Kim, maybe we'll talk about this, but we have cards about the Exum history project that she is a part of and has launched.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. And thank you everybody for coming. How many of you are aware of all of the cool things that are happening this weekend as part of the Centennial celebration? I know some people are here who are part of the Exum and JTG Women's Climb. So that is happening this weekend. We've got groups of all women climbing the Grand Teton, 2 groups actually. One group watching on Saturday, one on Sunday. And there are also events at the Climbers Ranch in the park, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday nights, and Tuesday night there's a party. All the events are free, but tickets are required. And if you reach out to the Climbers Ranch, just contact them. They can give you more information. There's movie nights and discussions, and Kelly Halpin is speaking. And then on Tuesday, the 29th, there's a big party. So lots of things happening to celebrate. And this is the kickoff event. So welcome. All right, so we are celebrating 100 years of women climbers in the Tetons. My name is Kimberly Geil, and before we get started, let's see, how many of you have climbed in the Tetons at some point? You're like, raise your hand if you have climbed in the Tetons. Oh, look at that, that's like 90%, 95 at least. That's very cool. Okay, how many of you haven't yet, but you would like to? Okay, all right. Well, there's lots of people here who can help you out. And how many of you identify as women? Let's see how many women we have. Good, good. It looks like more than half. It's cool. That's what I was hoping for. Well, as you know, we are just a few days away from the 100th anniversary of Eleanor Davis's first recorded female ascent of the Grand Teton. It was on August 27th, 1923. And it's worth mentioning that was only the third party to have done so, right? Oh, sorry. That is gonna happen again in 30 minutes, but we'll ignore it. So to celebrate this achievement, I'm gonna share with you some things I turned up in my research about Eleanor Davis, which I didn't know, so maybe you don't know them either. I thought they were some interesting things. I will then mention a few other women who were climbing early in the Tetons, and in the interest of time, I won't go into too much depth, and then I'll introduce our 5 amazing panelists. We'll have them each share about a meaningful climb or a first in their life, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, so think about what you might want to ask them. So for those of you who don't know me, my uncle Peter Lev was one of the 4 guides that Glenn Exum sold Exum mountain guides to when he retired, when Glenn retired. And I first came to the Tetons when I was 12 to visit my uncle. And he took me up to the lower saddle and I hung out with the marmots while he took some people up to the top. I wasn't a climber then, I didn't want to be a climber, but I really love the Tetons. I mean, they're magical, right? Like, don't you want to be in the Tetons? They're just an amazing place. So I wanted to come back to the Tetons. And I do have notes because there's no way I'll remember everything I want to tell you without, so. So I eventually found my niche working in the Exum office, which I've been doing since 1996. Unlike all the women I'm going to tell you about and the ones on our panel, I was not a climber, like I said. I didn't want to be. When I first took the classes at Exum, I was terrified. Why would anybody want to go climbing? I thought it was crazy. But I eventually learned that the systems work. I learned to love climbing, and I've now, at this point, climbed most all the peaks in the range. So I don't panic now every time I climb. So basically, would I do even a fraction of what these women up here would do? No, but that makes me a good candidate to pull together their stories and share them with you, which is also part of what I've been doing with the Exum History Project. You can check that out. So today's talk, however, is not about Exum, but rather the women who, whether as guides or just as badass climbers, forged a path for so other women and men to follow. And I'll be drawing on the work of Rennie Jackson, Paul Horton, Sherry Smith, Molly Loomis, Julie Ellison, among others. I'm grateful to all of them, and several of them are here tonight, but any mistakes, which I'm sure there will be, are mine. So let's get started. As you may know, there's some controversy about who was the first recorded party to summit the Grand Teton, but most concur it was Billy Owen, Frank Peterson, John Shive, and Franklin Spaulding on August 11th, 1898. It's worth noting that Billy Owen had been trying to climb the Grand Teton for years, and in 1891, he reached a point somewhere between the lower and the upper saddles from Dartmouth Basin, but not alone. He was with his wife, Emma Matilda, and his friend Matthew Dawson, and Matthew's wife, Jenny. So even though Billy's wife was not with him when he eventually scaled the peak, she had clearly been involved in the process. So you could even say that Emma Matilda Owen and Jenny Dawson were the first women that we know of to attempt the Grand Teton. Now, it was a full 25 years before the next recorded climb of the Grand. On August 25th, 1923, so 100 years ago tomorrow, 3 climbers from Montana reached the summit. This was technically the third ascent because other members of Billy Owen's party, Spaulding, Shive, and Peterson, had climbed the Grand Teton a few days later in 1898 to put a cairn on top. And this is a copy of the original summit registers. So you can see the first 2 ascents in 1898 by Billy Owen's party, and then the Montana boys, the college students, 25 years later. But back to August 1923. So another party of 8 mountaineers was camping in what is now Garnet Canyon. They had been invited by Horace Albright, he was the superintendent of Yellowstone National Park, who wanted to attract more climbers and more attention to the Tetons in hopes that they too would become protected. Among this group was Eleanor Davis. She was the physical education instructor at Colorado College, and she was vice president of the Colorado Mountain Club, and also Albert Ellingwood, who also was a professor at Colorado College of History and Political Science, and also part of the Colorado Mountain Club. So they knew each other both from the Mountain Club and also colleagues at Colorado College. They'd done quite a bit of climbing together, first starting out hiking together. It seems that Ellingwood was very impressed with He was freshly back from Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and he was impressed with Davis's physical prowess and started teaching her the mountaineering techniques he learned in Europe. This is Ellingwood, Barton Hogue, and Davis on top of Pyramid Peak in 1919. We don't have a lot of photos of Eleanor Davis, but she's over on the right in the hat. So Ellingwood was considered one of the strongest climbers in the country at the time, and Davis was his frequent climbing partner and an outstanding climber in her own right. Davis was 2 years older than Ellingwood. Their partnership doesn't appear to have had any romantic side to it. They were just climbing partners, as all of you who've had climbing partners of the opposite sex know how that works. Ellingwood would later marry, and his wife would often accompany them on expeditions at the beginnings or help getting supplies. We know from Ellingwood's diary that when they came out on this trip to the Tetons, they traveled by train and they stopped at the Great Salt Lake for a day where they went swimming. And then they went up to Yellowstone because they've been invited up by Horace Albright. They visited Old Faithful, and then they rode on the top of a supply truck down to the Tetons. It was filled with oats, so they sat on top of the oats along with their baggage. And then they did a scouting trip up, I believe it was what's now known as Disappointment Peak, and then selected a camp in what's now Garnet Canyon, but it was called Bradley Canyon at the time. So Eleanor Davis wrote later an article in Trails and Timberlines, which was the Colorado Mountain Club newsletter, about that trip. And she talked about how there weren't any trails other than those made by elk. And when they finally reached camp, they thought enviously of the day, surely not far distant, when a good trail will make this wonderfully beautiful canyon more accessible to campers. Well, Eleanor, that day has come. So Ellingwood described their campsite as a very inspiring location near the steep rushing stream with a wealth of waterfalls, walled in by towering cliffs on both sides, and with the splendid Middle Teton filling up the head of the canyon. The camp could hardly be more magnificent. So 2 days after the Montana students had summited, the Ellingwood and Davis party headed up. They went first to the west summit of the Grand to view the enclosure, a ring of slabs arranged most likely by Native Americans. At the upper saddle, however, all the others decided not to climb for various reasons, except for Eleanor and Albert. And climb they did through what Ellingwood called the wriggle, which I assume is now either the crawl or the belly roll, and skirting some ice in the chimney until they had reached the summit. So this was not only the first recorded female ascent, but only the third party summit and only the fourth recorded ascent of the peak, and the one we're celebrating this weekend. You can see Eleanor and Albert Ellingwood's in the middle. The fact that Eleanor Davis was on this early climb of the Grand Teton is notable because climbing was a very male-dominated sport at that time, but obviously she was capable and more than able to hold her own. Ellingwood writes in his diary that it was rather a long stretch to the first good hold, so I gave Elle, he called her Elle in his diary, a shoulder to get into the chimney. She anchored me up, no difficulty after the first stretch. She was climbing in sneakers, by the way. And just worth knowing, there were 6 other members of the party, all men, who chose not to go. So it was just Eleanor and Albert who actually went to the top. And to cap off their visit to the Tetons, 2 days later on August 29th, she and Albert Ellingwood completed the first recorded ascent of the South Teton, and Ellingwood did the first ascent of the Middle Teton, what's now the Ellingwood Couloir. The others would have joined him, but a storm came in. So not a bad trip for your first trip to the Tetons. After her climb of the Grand Teton, Eleanor was invited to join the American Alpine Club, a somewhat unusual invitation as the AAC was almost entirely men at that time. She went on to start a girls' climbing team at Colorado College in the physical education department where she taught, and the highlight every year was the climb of Pikes Peak. In 1930, at the age of 45, she married George Edgar Ehrman. He went by either George or Edgar, depending on the source, who she met through the Colorado Mountain Club. He was a widower with 3 children. He liked to fish more than he liked to climb, but according to Eleanor, most of the places he liked to fish involved climbing, so that was all right by her. According to an article written in the Colorado Springs Gazette-Telegraph when she was 93, she was still walking and riding an exercise bicycle daily. The caption reads, Eleanor Erman works out on the exercycle. She can chalk up mileage to put youngsters to shame. Same article also says that she slept outdoors on her patio all summer. That was a habit she picked up in her climbing days. They didn't have lightweight bedrolls or tents or packs, only the most primitive gear. And usually they just strung a tarp between two trees if they had any shelter at all. She only remembered one time when they had a tent on their climbing adventures. So Eleanor was doing activities that not everyone approved of at the time. Janet Robertson wrote a book, The Magnificent Mountain Women, and writes that when Eleanor was a student, she and a friend were trying to hike in the Tarryall Peaks near Colorado Springs. They asked a ranger about places to stay, and the ranger said, oh, all the ranchers are really friendly and you won't have any trouble finding a place. But that first afternoon, when they knocked on the door of a likely looking ranch, the woman who answered the door was scandalized that Eleanor and her companion were wearing knickerbockers. This woman at the ranch said that not only would she refuse to take in women who were dressed like men, but when they asked where the next ranch was, she said she was on a party line and she was going to warn all the other ranches in the area of some women dressed in trousers. So in the end, Eleanor and her friends slept in a haystack and hiked up the next day. So if you weren't a man, not so friendly after all, as it turned out. So other women at the time often climbed in skirts. This is another picture from that same book of some women climbing the third Flatiron in Colorado. You can see that several of them are wearing skirts, but Eleanor typically hiked in the much more practical trousers worn by men. She was always an outstanding athlete. She was a graduate of the Boston Normal School of Gymnastics, which was one of the first physical education teacher training programs in the country, and which later became part of Wellesley College. And she made her career in physical ed. She was once quoted as saying she was never scared while climbing, as she always had a good head, and she wasn't bothered by heights either. As a young child, she'd always had a good kinesthetic sense, something you either have or you don't, but she had it. Now, she wasn't a tall woman. She was probably only about 5'2", which might explain why Ellingwood was giving her a shoulder on that first move. But she was strong and fast. Robert Orms, who climbed with her more than once, was quoted as saying she was a little wren of a type, very tough and strong and not disturbed by altitude, and a damn good climber and nervy. She was noted by other climbers as being outstanding in the sport. Fred Becky said that Ellingwood and Davis were likely the most experienced climbers of the era in his book, 100 Favorite North American Climbs, and in 50 Classic Climbs of North America. Stephen Roper wrote that Eleanor Davis was undoubtedly the most experienced American female climber. This was particularly due to her crestone ascents in Colorado with Ellingwood, the last 14er in Colorado to be climbed and one that had been thought to be impossible. They did the crestone needle in 1916 and the crestone arête in 1925. For that climb in 1916, which did include five other women, although we think Ellingwood and Davis were the only ones to summit. Okay. They actually hiked over 100 miles from Colorado Springs to Canyon City to save on train fare over a weekend. Davis is quoted as saying they didn't have a lot of cash in those days. And they finally got to Crestone and got a burro to haul the rest of their supplies in, and we're heading out. So despite all the things that Eleanor accomplished, mostly they've gone unnoticed, right? Ellingwood has multiple peaks and routes named after him, but Davis has none. While there have been calls for this to be rectified, so far, no peaks have been named in her honor, but maybe someday, right? She died in 1993 at the age of 107. She lived a long and rich life and notched multiple first ascents in Colorado, Wyoming, and elsewhere that have inspired generations of climbers after her. Some of those women are here today, and we'll hear their stories in a moment, but first, a quick timeline of other notable women climbers in the Tetons. So the next woman to climb the Grand Teton after Eleanor was local Geraldine Lucas. So the young Paul Petzold, who climbed the Grand in 1924, so the next year at the age of 16, was working at her brother's ranch and starting his ascent from going through her ranch. So Billy Owen had asked Petzold to take him up again, although he was 65 years old by then, and Geraldine wanted to go too. So they did not succeed on their first attempt, but they tried again, and Geraldine became the second and oldest recorded woman to summit the Grand Teton at the age of 58 on August 2nd, 1924. And she was ahead of her time too. She had been briefly married and had a son, but had gotten divorced, had actually gotten the courts to change her son's name back to her maiden name, which was very unusual. She'd then gone back to college to get her degree, which was also very unusual, at Oberlin, and she eventually homesteaded in Jackson following several of her siblings out, and you can still visit her ranch today. Paul Petzel, in his book Teton Tales, quotes her as asking him point blank if he would take her up the Grand, saying that she had heard talk around town that it's no place for a woman and that women should not be allowed up there. But people just don't understand women like myself. In 1926, Eleanor Davis came back to the Tetons and she climbed Mount Moran, made her the first woman to do so. Irene Ayres was doing a lot of routes in the 1930s with her brother, Fred Ayres. In 1932, she was the first woman to climb Disappointment Peak and Storm Point and Symmetry Spire. And in 1934, she made either first ascents or first female ascents of Owen and Rock of Ages and Rock Chuck and Traverse and Bivouac Peaks. Margaret Smith, another early climber, you may recognize that. That's what they turned into the flyer for this, was that from that photo. Later, she became Margaret Craighead. She was climbing a lot. Her father was a naturalist and working in the park, and she got to know climbers like Glenn Exum and Paul Petzel and Jack Durrance and joined them on their climbing adventures. By the time she was 16, she'd climbed most of the peaks in the range. And in 1939, along with 3 other women, they set out to do the first manless ascent, the first ascent. That's what it was called in those days, of the Grand Teton, and succeeded. But because women's success on climbs was often attributed to men helping them by carrying their packs or hauling them up or whatever it was, the women left really early in the morning to make sure they were the first ones on top so that no one could accuse them of having needed a man's assistance. The next year in 1940, Elizabeth Betsy Powles was making first ascents of the north ridges of both the Grand and Mount Moran. And then she also did the first female ascents of Buck Mountain and Veiled Peak. And according to reports, she was quite frequently leading these ascents. Dave Dornan, who's here tonight, was sharing with me in an email that women ruled the Tetons 100 years ago. And Wyoming does have a history of being a little bit more accepting in some ways of women, right? Even before becoming a state, Wyoming women had the right to vote. And in 1920, Jackson elected an all-female town government. So there was some precedent for women to take on roles and adventures that might not be considered as appropriate elsewhere in the country. Reddy Jackson, who's also here, writes that strong female climbers were rarely seen in the predominantly male-dominated sport of mountaineering. Yet here we see in the Tetons a tradition that has continued to the present day, namely noteworthy alpine achievements by women who could hold their own in the sport. And even Paul Petzel, who's quite opinionated about lots of things, changed his mind about what women were and were not capable of the mountains, writing that I think we've all been brainwashed to assume that women are not as strong as men. And he explains that after observing women carry heavy packs on long trips, in his experience, women have more endurance than men on the long pole, and we have found them stronger psychologically under stress. There is something about a woman that after they get confidence in themselves, they don't panic. They're not thrown by unusual circumstances. They can make decisions under pressure and they can really carry their load. By the 1970s, women were starting to make inroads as rangers. This was before any women had become climbing guides. The first female backcountry ranger, Jane Baldwin, was hired in 1974. In 1977, Anne Marie Rizzi became the first female Jenny Lake climbing ranger, followed by Jean Dempsey in 1978, and Barb Eastman and Macquarie in 1980, who also completed the first all-female ascent of the direct south buttress on Moran that same summer. We had hoped, by the way, to have one of the first female climbing rangers on the panel, but unfortunately weren't able to make that happen. Barb Eastman was the most likely local candidate. She's on a canoeing trip, but she sends her regards. Many other women were climbing hard in the range. We can't possibly mention them all, and they are continuing to do so today. So tonight, we are joined by 5 women who have all notched their own incredible achievements climbing the Tetons and elsewhere. So I'm going to introduce each one of them so you'll know something about what they've done. And then we'll have them share about one of their adventures, and then we'll open it up to questions. So we are going to start with Irene Beardsley. We're going to go in alphabetical order, which also happens to be age order, turns out. Anyway, Irene started climbing when she was an undergraduate at Stanford, and she joined the Stanford Alpine Club, where she learned the fundamentals and did some climbs in Yosemite. She met and later married Lee Ortenberger, the original author of The Climber's Guide to the Teton Range. Lee was a graduate student at Berkeley and would come down to Stanford purportedly to meet women. Apparently that worked. And Irene was the 3rd Stanford Alpine Club woman he had dated. But it's important to point out that Irene joined the Stanford Alpine Club of her own accord well before she met Lee. It was, however, through Lee that Irene ended up in the Tetons, although she'd driven through as a teenager and had been captivated by the peaks. Their first full summer, Lee had a guided trip with Exum mountain guides up the Grand, and Irene wanted to go, but Glenn Exum wouldn't let her. Glenn Exum was unfortunately very old-fashioned and out of step, I would say, when it came to women. Very supportive of his male guides, he did not think women should guide. However, Lee hurt his Achilles on that trip and couldn't climb for a while afterwards. Irene was starting to get bored, so Lee arranged for his friend, John Dietschy, to go out with her several climbs. One was on the Exum Ridge, and Irene led it. She'd said she wanted to lead, and so she led it even though she'd never climbed it before. And on another, they did the first ascent of what John later christened Irene's Arête, although Irene didn't find that out until months later. It's now known as one of the classic climbs, and that was in 1957. And here's a picture of Irene on that first ascent of Irene's Arête. In 1963, Glenn was desperate for another guide to help Herb Swedlund with a group of 9 climbers on Cube Point. So reluctantly, he hired Irene as an assistant guide. Irene recalls on that climb that Herb never tided. He told Irene to do all the leading and all the belaying, which she did, and Herb floated. So that makes Irene, as far as we know, the first official female guide at Exum, even though it was just that one time, although certainly not by her choice. In 1965, Irene and Sue Swedlund, Herb's wife, did the first all-female ascent of the north face of the Grand. Irene handled the snow and ice pitches and getting over the Bergschrund, and Sue did all the rock pitches. Irene was pregnant with their 2nd child at the time, so couldn't risk a lead fall, but wanted to do something unique in the mountains before that daughter came along. Irene was also on the all-women's expedition to Annapurna in 1978, organized by her friend Arlene Bloom, who was a running partner of hers, and Irene did successfully summit. Funds were raised for the expedition in part through sales of t-shirts that said a woman's place is on top, and I know there's one actually in the audience tonight. Yes. In addition to these accomplishments, Irene has a PhD in solid state physics. She's only the 4th woman at Stanford to receive a PhD in physics. She had a full career working at IBM. She also once had a flying squirrel as a pet. Still hikes in the Tetons regularly. She just turned 88 and recently started studying ancient Greek. All right, next I want to introduce you to Beverly Boynton, or Bev as many know her. Bev is the only woman on the panel who did not become a guide, so she climbed hard as or harder than her frequently male partners, and climbed for the enjoyment and the challenge rather than making it her profession. She grew up in Boston and hooked up with a group of climbers there that were very active. They go top roping 3-4 times a week, go to the Gunks or Cathedral or Canyon every weekend, and on every school vacation, they take extended trips to Seneca, Quebec, the Alps, the Dolomites, and then they come west in the summers. She had a mentor there named Bob who really pushed her and other women to lead. Everyone was expected to lead, and they climbed all sorts of rock. Good, bad, wet, dry, dirty, whatever. So it was a great training ground for her. Bev thought she would move to Estes Park for the climbing, but she visited some friends here in the winter and fell in love with the skiing, and she stayed. That was 1981. At first, she thought she had ruined her climbing career by moving here, but she grew to love the Tetons. She was never interested in fame or fortune or even first ascents, although she did do several. in her climbing career. She wanted to climb things she hadn't climbed before and figures she's easily done over 100 routes in the Tetons, a record perhaps only exceeded by Paul Horton, who's also here, who was often the only other person she would run into in these obscure places. From 1975 into the early 2000s, climbing was her passion. She would climb with whoever she thought would be able to do the climb with her and was available. And since there were more men around than women, she did a lot of climbing with other men. She did have some strong women climbing partners, but her goal was to climb and she didn't care who it was with. And she always wanted to at least swap leads, and it was even better when she could do all the leading herself. In 1984, she was a climber on an expedition of Jacksonites to the Himalayan peak Kumbhakarna or Janu, the 32nd highest mountain in the world. She personally got to about 20,000 feet, but found she didn't care for this type of climbing. She then met the man who would become her husband, Whitey, in 1990. He was a fabulous skier, but not a climber. And that was fine by Bev. If he didn't climb hard, then she didn't want him to climb at all. Bev has first ascents on Thor Peak, Dihedral Forest, and Cladwell Peak, to name a few. This is on the crux pitch of Thor Peak. She climbed South Buttress Right on Moran with her friend Bob Graham her first year here. The crux traverse, the crux pitch, ended up being her lead, and Bob said that it hadn't yet been climbed free. But Bev hadn't done a lot of aid climbing and thought it would be more interesting, so she did aid it, even though looking back on it, she thinks, well, I could have climbed it, I should have just climbed it free. Since the mid-2000s, multiple surgeries and illnesses have stopped Bev from climbing, but never one to sit still. She has taken up canoeing in the Arctic as a replacement. Next on our illustrious panel is Catherine Cullinane. Catherine grew up in California. Her father served in the 10th Mountain Division, and the family frequently went on backpacking trips all over the Sierra Nevadas and elsewhere. When she was 5 or 6, they even did a trip to the Wind Rivers to Island Lakes, so she grew up spending time in the mountains. She took a year off after high school, got a job as a cashier in the cafeteria at Yosemite, and it was there that she met some climbers and really got into rock climbing. She'd done a little bit in high school in the Bay Area, as well as peak baying with her dad and brother, and eventually she met Chuck Pratt, T.M. Herbert, Kim Schmitz, all of whom were guides at Exum. In either 1980 or 81, she took a trip with a friend to Jackson and did some climbs and hikes with those guides that she'd met, and then came back the next summer. She met Margot, Catherine's on the left, and Margot, and her friend Jamie, then Jane, who are all here. And Margot's working in the Exum office, and she got recruited to carry a few loads up to the saddle, propane, ropes, things like that. Then they needed an assistant guide to help with a big group. By this time, Glenn had retired and had sold it to Peter, Al, Rod, and Dean. And she did more and more guiding, becoming Exum's first female full-time guide, at least by 1982. So Jack Tackle, who started the same year as Catherine, said that Catherine could climb rock better than anyone else in the guide service at the time. She was climbing fairly hard 5'11", and it wasn't sport climbing. In 1986, she was invited on an expedition to Everest, organized by David Brashears. They hoped to find out whether or not Mallory and Irvine had reached the summit, and also place the first American woman on top, of which there were 3 of them on the expedition, Catherine being one. Unfortunately, weather prevented a go at the summit, but the climb was made into a 1987 film for Mutual of Omaha's Spirit of Adventure series called Mount Everest American First. Early in her time in the Tetons, she met Rennie Jackson on a climb of Owen, then a Jenny Lake climbing ranger. And he is now just about to release the new edition of the Climber's Guide to the Teton Range. You can pre-order it now. I think it comes out September 1st. They got married and have one daughter, Jane, who knows the prize, also an incredible climber. Her family still climb the Grand Teton every year on her birthday in July. She has no plans to stop anytime soon. And she also had a 20-year career as an obstetrics, labor, and delivery nurse. She loved being parts of all stages of a child's birth and was the diabetes self-management educator at St. John's for 10 years. All right, moving on to yet another first, we have Sue Miller. She was the first full-time female guide at Jackson Hole Mountain Guides. She grew up in Massachusetts, went to Colby College, was on the lumberjack team, and yes, that means what you think it means. She went on a Knowles course in college, National Outdoor Leadership School, founded by Paul Petzel, who also founded Exum Mountain Guides. That course took her out west for the first time, and she found that she liked being out west. So after graduating from college, she took the Knowles instructor course, worked there for several years before coming to the Tetons and climbing the Skillet Glacier on Moran with a Knowles colleague. She also worked in Alaska with Knowles for a few summers, but didn't like all the ice. She wanted to do more rock climbing. She also had some really strong women role models at Knowles. Badass women who were actually a little scary at times. They were very sure of themselves, dominant, and it was a great way to be introduced to female leadership and what it could look like. And they gave her the confidence to seek out mountaineering. She had met and hooked up with Greg Collins. He was a dedicated climber. They ultimately bought a house in Lander and put up many of the routes in Sinks Canyon. She continued to work for Knowles. She loved being in the outdoors, teaching others to love the outdoors, because conservation was a driving force for her. But she latched on to the idea of guiding in the Tetons, even though she'd only been here that one time. She was friends with Rob Hess, who was then a guide at JHMG, and he thought she could get hired on if she applied. So she did, and Andy Carson, the owner at the time, had faith in her ability and hired her. So she was intent on busting some of those patriarchal norms, right? The idea that women couldn't do all the things that men were doing. And it's also important to point out here that while her partner Greg did become a guide at JHMG, it was her idea and she became a guide first. A 2021 Women's History Facebook post honored Sue, saying that she is soft-spoken and humble, a talented skier, climber, avalanche educator, and Knowlesy. There's the 30 minutes. Those of us who have had the privilege of Sue's mentorship all agree her totem animal is an eagle. She is wise and has an elevated perspective. She worked at Knowles for over 20 years, winning their Instructor of the Year award. She guided at JHMG when she was 27 until she was 45, and then she turned her focus to gardening, something she still does today at Snowdrift Farms, growing food for herself, local families, and also the Teton Valley Food Pantry, of which she's on the board. And last but definitely not least, we have Georgie Stanley. Georgie was one of the first few female guides at JHMG, coming after Sue, Lynn Wolf, Chris-Ann Christel, and Nancy Carson. She also got her introduction to the mountains through Knowles. Her first trip was a backpacking trip, and she was starstruck by Carol, one of the instructors. She took a semester off from Brown, where she started at college, to go on a Knowles trip to Aconcagua, and liked the mountains so much, she transferred to the University of Colorado at Boulder to finish up, and then began teaching at Knowles the summer before she graduated. She met Phil Powers on the Aconcagua trip, and they started dating. And then at Knowles, she met Sue Miller, and they became friends, doing trips together as instructors and climbing together on the weekends. She was climbing and guiding in Alaska. She was actually only the second lead female guide on Denali out of all the companies there. Despite the fact there had been plenty of female guides, they had not been lead guides. She was only the second one. And she also climbed internationally, including a trip to Pakistan in 1995, where she was the only woman. Unfortunately, weather prevented them from going for the summit, but she got a nice letter from Rod Newcomb inviting her to become a guide at Exum Mountain Guides. Rod's son Mark had been on the expedition, so she expects that's where Rod got the idea. But all of Georgie's friends, Sue, Lynn Wolf, Rob Hess, and others were guides at JHMG, so she decided to start guiding there instead, plus she liked the smaller size. She guided at JHMG until the early 2000s, when her mother's death inspired her to start gardening, something she knew nothing about. She eventually started Snowdrift Farms and joined forces with Sue Miller, who's still managing the farm today. She was also a member of only the second All-American Women's Expedition to an 8,000-meter peak. The first was the 1978 Annapurna expedition that Irene Beardsley was a member of. So the 1999 Women's Century Expedition to Choyu, the sixth highest mountain in the world, was formed of 6 women, including Catherine Miller-Hess, JHMG guide and new owner, Amy Bullard and Kara Liberator, Exum guides. This was also the first American women's expedition to an 8,000-meter peak that did not use supplemental oxygen or Sherpa climbing support. So they did it entirely on their own. And Georgie, Amy, and Catherine all successfully summited. So Georgie's oldest daughter just went off to college. So the kids are a little older now than they are in this picture. And she regularly climbs along with Sue Miller with her 16-year-old son, Bayo. So there you have it. Wow. Yay. 100 years of women climbers in the Tetons, and an introduction to our panelists, who I will invite to come up. Now we're going to hear from them. So we're gonna have them start by just briefly telling us what they love about Jackson and the Tetons. Can you all still hear me? Yeah. I haven't called on anybody yet. You're okay. But Irene specifically asked to not go first. So would somebody else like to volunteer? That is gonna volunteer. All right, so you're just gonna share just briefly what you love about Jackson and the Tetons. That one right there.
Is this loud enough?
It's not on.
Is it on? Is that okay? Now? Oh, yeah. Well, I was lucky when I started climbing because I started post-Teton, but pre-camming devices. So we were using stoppers and eccentrics. That's my original ones. I was so proud of them. But they were almost an art form to put in. And they're very, very versatile and they're lightweight. But of course, when cams came along, everybody switched. Eccentrics went into the shed. And stoppers have managed to stay with the camming devices. Yeah. The other thing that was really lucky for me is my group of climbers in Boston. It seemed they just assumed that I was going to be their equals and that of course I was going to lead. There was never any fuss over that, which I think was really lucky because this is in the mid-70s when there was a lot going on with feminism and a lot of other stuff too. So that was lucky. And my group, as Kim mentioned in the introduction, liked to travel and climb everywhere. Henry Bargle was one of the Eastern climbers, and he was a big inspiration to me because he climbed around the world and was the best. So I ended up in Jackson in '81. I had done climbing here in the '70s, but the length of the routes in the mountains is what really attracted me. I did all the classic routes and I did a lot of sport climbing, not so much sport climbing really, but cragging around the country and elsewhere. But the big mountain routes, that's what really hit me. That's what I think of now. When I'm ski skating the road in the park, it takes me a long time because I keep stopping and looking at it. I've been here, I've been there, I remember that. So I did a lot of long ones that were hard, the 9 and 10 range, but the one that I guess I would like to mention now is our first ascent on Mount Thor, which is somewhat behind Moran. But from that road, you can see this big dihedral high up on Thor. It's so obvious that of course I wanted to climb it. I have no idea if I asked anyone anything about it, but there it was. And my friend Rob Mahoney, who I climbed with a lot, he used to always say, okay, and go. So we headed off for Thor, which is over 12,000 feet. And the wall itself is 1,200 to 1,500 feet and quite steep. We had to canoe across Lee Lake, which was easy. I always had tailwinds. And we had a bushwhack up Lee Canyon, which is not so easy, but we got to a little lake way in that had the one flat spot for a tent. The next day we headed up towards Thor, And it's that kind of tailless where you take a step up and you slide half a step back. It took a long time, it was far, it was steep. And then we got to the base of the mountain, which had a snowfield and a bird shrine, which was totally icy and hard. So that was a challenge to get onto the rock. Then the climbing was pretty moderate, 5-7 maybe, chimneys, ledges, friction slabs, until we got to the Big V chimney. And lucky me, I got the first lead in the chimney. And it was quite hard with the protection. It was a 5'9", and I remember going up above Rob a good distance, going up a little more, and not seeing where I was going to put a piece in. So I did study that for a while, and then I saw a potential place, and I went up, hoping that it would be a place, and I whipped out a number 4 stopper and clonk, it went right in. We had 2 more pitches of 5'9", and then scrambling to get to the top. The descent was beautiful. This was, I think, early August, and the wildflowers were at their peak. I remember a little waterfall in there, back down to our tent, out to Lee Lake and back. I also, in the Tetons, really liked the history. And after I did that, actually, no, a few days before we went, Glenn Exum was in the ICU. He was my patient. And we talked about this climb because Pownell, Exum, and a guy named Mike, I forget his last name. Brewer. They were the powerhouses of Teton climbing. And they had gone up. And it really reflects that we had better gear and better shoes. But they went up and they tried really hard to get into that V chimney and move up, but they were unable to. So after we did the climb, I wrote Glenn a letter, and he was really gracious. He must have reformed with his view on women. Because he was just totally happy that I got up. I told him all about the raspberries on the descent, and he wrote me a really nice letter. So he was a gentleman, but he did reform a bit on that. So that's exactly the kind of climbs I really like. I've done a bunch in the Alps and Dolomites, but the Tetons really had ones that equal of there. So that's me.
Irene looks
I can go.
Irene, okay, go. Irene's gonna go.
Well, I can honestly say that before college, I thought about climbing twice, but I didn't know any climbers, anybody, I'd never, one was driving past the Tetons, and another one was visiting Tennessee with my then high school boyfriend, and there was a big chimney there, and we thought if we got a rope, maybe we could get up and together. But then at Stanford, I looked around for a group that I could be comfortable with, and immediately found the Stanford Alpine Club, and it never looked back. And these were the people I wanted to be with. And one of the things that I particularly like about the Tetons is the same thing as at Stanford. The friends, the way you feel about the people you share a rope with, it just is so wonderful. And let's see, if I hadn't met Lee, I probably would not have had anywhere near the career I've had, but at least I had started before I met him. and I was the third. So let's see, some things that I did that were fun. We did the first Tyrolean traverse off the Lost Arrow in Yosemite, which was pretty amazing. And climbing here, I started to lead a bit. I had a different experience than Bev, because in the club, they told us, well, there were some women who were really good, but you're not so good. But I did start to lead, and I climbed with women, and that was good. I climbed with Julie Peterson, who was the niece of Chuck Pricksell, who was one of the first rangers. And I climbed with my 17-year-old babysitter, Gran, and she'd never climbed before. And things like that. And then I got to go twice to Peru, where we climbed maybe 8 peaks between 19 and 22,000. And I was apparently the first woman to climb Huascaran. And then Lee got invited to go to Makalu by Sir Edmund Hillary on the expedition that was looking for the abominable snowman. And the 6 wives got to walk into base camp, but Hillary got rid of us just as fast as he could after we got to base camp. Sent us out on an airplane. But then I got permission to go back in and help Barry Bishop, so I spent 3 months at 19,000 feet helping Barry with its experiments. But I had it in my mind that I thought I could climb a high mountain, and I had family and all that, but then the opportunity came when I was 43 to go with Arlene, and that was probably the most remarkable experience in my life. And that's about the last climb of the Grand Teton was with Paul Horton. Who else?
How old were you last time you climbed the Grand?
We think that was 75. It was very slow.
All right, who wants to go next? Let's see if that microphone works. Okay. Or no, you go. Okay, I think I should go. Does that work? No.
We can try places.
Does that work?
Try now.
Does that work? No. Does that work? Maybe I just stand up.
Passing this one.
Yeah.
One magic mic.
That can have another meaning also, couldn't it? How about that? Yeah, there we go. So I'm glad to go before there's nothing else to be said, but there's lots to be said about the Tetons, right? So what do I love about the Tetons? It's our home, and having a home range like this is such a gift. We've all chosen a terrific life for ourselves, haven't we? Yeah. I love how steep they are. I love how they go straight up from the valley, so you don't have to hike for miles to get to them. Sometimes you get to go home at night. Now I choose to camp before I climb instead of trying to do everything in a day, because we just want to be in the mountains more. We don't get up there as much. I love how the rock keeps changing on you. I don't particularly like the white rock. It seems a little slippery, but I like that. I like how they seem to be made for skiing as well as climbing. I love how there's so many climbs and so much terrain that's quite doable, quite easy, quite fun to be able to move fluidly. I love my friends. I love the people I climb with. I love the people I got to work with as a guide. And I used to love showing people the mountains. I got a little tired of that. It's fun with my friends. Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about any of your adventures, or are you good?
In the Tetons?
Wherever.
Wherever. Well, I don't have a lot of firsts. I don't, and that first on Choyu is more of a marketing tool, really, and it more shows that women at that time, that was 1999, were climbing with our guy friends, and American women weren't doing a lot of all women's ascents anymore. I think
maybe the Russian or the Japanese or the Chinese were still doing all women climbs. But I think at the point where I was climbing, starting to climb and committing a lot of my time to it, we were very well accepted with our guy friends and getting invited to go along. Anyway, it was great. I think I might have been the first woman to climb to get to the top of Mount Huntington though. And that was a tremendous mountain and pretty scary, pretty dangerous really, but I survived that one. Let's see, just to mix it up a little bit, I was thinking about the climbs I'd done in the Tetons and had so many wonderful experiences with so many climbs, but one climb that I keep coming back to is just being a hoot was the tunnel route on Cullinane. Hilarious. And you know, one of those climbs you just feel like nobody's been there before and it's only you and your friends and just gorgeous, just gorgeous. And it's like on the north side of Cullinane, so it's a completely different view than I'm used to. So there you go.
Oh, perfect. The lights are really bright. I'm gonna piggyback off of that, because I did that with Rennie one day when Jane was in school, and we ran up Teton and went through the tunnel, and I was like, this is so cool. And then we ran down and picked her up at school. But don't tell anyone. Yes. So I found my people here in the Tetons. I learned to climb in Yosemite and spent a lot of time in the mountains with my family, as Kimberly read. And I had climbed a lot in Yosemite, you know, really solid cracks and beautiful granite. And then I came out here and fell in love with the mountains and the flowers and the green. And, you know, California was dry, it still is. And I have to say the rock never grabbed me that much because it terrified me, except for the milk roots, you know. And those are the ones that I guided, and I love guiding them all the time with people. And back in the day, you know, we had like I would guide with the owners, sort of as an apprentice guide at first, and we would have, you know, we'd tie in with the bowline. We would teach each person how to belay the next person behind them, and so it was this long train up Exum Ridge or wherever everyone's balding. And yeah, it was amazing. I loved it. I was in nursing school. I made money to go through school, and I got to go climbing, and it was the best. And it still is, my people. And I'm glad you said that about Rennie was, as we were driving in today, about Ms. Davis and her the other one, ascent she did in 1926, right? Moran. And then the other one 2 days later. I didn't know that. So Rennie just told me, and I was like, oh, that's a great piece of information about an amazing woman. So yeah, actually, I'm very honored that I'm here with this amazing crew also, and a lot in the audience as well. So thank you very much.
Well, I've been asked what I like or love the most about Jackson and the Tetons, and I came out from the East Coast when I was 20 to Lander and the Wind Rivers, and the mountains there, I mean, there's just so much space and, you know, room for freedom and running around and fishing and climbing. I just loved it, and I was like, this is where I've been needing to be my whole life. It's funny because in my bedroom growing up, I had this poster. I had a horse. I loved horses, and there was a poster in my bedroom of these horses in front of these mountains. And later, I realized they were the Tetons. That's where I was meant to find, but I still remember the first time I saw the Tetons, I drove over Georgie Pass from Lander, and I was like, oh my gosh. And then, I don't know, I love everything about all the mountains in this western space. I certainly, like these ladies have said, I found my people, I found where I was meant to be, but I also just really love the open space and how it's, you know, preserved, it's wilderness, there's room for animals, people, birds, there's room for everything, and it's not all crowded out yet. And I just, yeah, love going and exploring in the mountains, and I have ever since. So that's what I guess I love the most about this place, just room to roam. As far as first, Paul Harton, who's been oft-quoted tonight, has informed me that I was the first full-time female guide at Jackson Hole Mountain Guides. That was starting in the year of the Yellowstone fires in 1988. So it was an interesting year. And I learned, well, it was interesting all in all. There was ash falling in high camp a lot during August from the Yellowstone fires. It was kind of a rough crowd. The guys were, you know, poking fun at me a lot, and I didn't really know anyone at the guides other than Rob, so I got to meet some interesting characters. Tried to break me in a little bit, and but they became really good friends of mine, and it was just what I like to do, so I kept coming back, and I kept coming back for many years, other than some expeditions. So that's my first.
Okay, we've had a chance to hear from all of them, and I think we've got time for a few questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and then I'll repeat it into the microphone so everybody can hear it, or I'll bring you the microphone.
Okay, so I get it. Thanks, and thanks, Kim, for a great presentation. I love your story. I assume you wrote most of it, and very, very enlightening and well put together and well spoken. Thank you. So just I do have a little question for Irene, and that is any little tidbit stories that would enlighten us about your namesake, Red, and what happened on the first time you went up that thing?
Well, it was way over my current climbing ability at that time. I'd only been climbing for a few years and not very advanced level. And that John had this thing in mind, and we got camped up at the caves, and then after dinner, he went up on top and smoked a pipe and looked at the ridge. And I was kind of dreading it, to be honest. But he was great to climb with. In fact, he was such a gentleman. He hauled the pack on every pitch and I had to take out roughly 5, pitons, angled pitons. I worked really hard coming up second, taking out all those pitons. But as I say, it was way over my head, but it worked, and it certainly paid off.
One of the great climbs.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a storm that first?
There was a storm. We got up to that. There's a big gap at the top where there's a very hard climb on the opposite face, and you can get under that rock. And we sat there, and I just sort of bawled because I was just, I had been brave all through the climbing.
But wasn't it the next day then that you were confident enough to then go lead the Exum Ridge?
Yes.
Another question, I see a hand there. It doesn't reach far enough, so I got you.
Any advice to the next generation?
Any advice to the next generation? Who wants to take it?
Georgie.
I was thinking about this when we were asked about our firsts, and I would say advice for the next generation or younger people is don't worry about the firsts. Enjoy your friends, enjoy the mountains, climb, take time out from your work to climb.
Does anybody else want to ask that? Have any other advice? I'm gonna go over there.
So this is a little bit of history of Jackson. I'm from Washington DC, but I've been climbing in Jackson for many years. And the first time I climbed the Grand was in 1963 as a 20-year-old. My parents left us for a couple days while they went up to Yellowstone. And my guide was your dad, Peter Love.
My uncle? Look at that. Thank you.
Were there any interactions with experiences or confrontations from these wildlife who must have seen this strangely unusual looking creature, and what are they doing climbing up that mountain? Probably they were very shocked to find these humans climbing up their mountain. What were your experiences with the wildlife when they would see you?
So the question is, did you have any interesting experiences with wildlife who might have been surprised to see humans in the mountains?
Just the occasional bear.
Just the occasional bear, says Catherine.
And a lot of scat of mice or marmots, or the little creatures. I mean, there were no moose up there, but yeah, it seems there was a lot of scat.
I was halfway up the Black Diagon Middle when a marmot came waddling down the dike and came up to me and took a piece of cheese out of my hand.
That's a good one. Maybe one or two more questions. I know we've already gone over, but I'm sure they'll stay if people want to come ask them individually. Yes.
This is kind of a historical question. I really like the tennis shoe ascent mentioned. And so I was curious about rappelling and when I assume kind of people down climb things early on and when did rappelling kind of become part of the route climbing?
So the question is, when did rappelling become something that you did instead of down climbing? And probably somebody can talk about body rappelling.
Paul, you're gonna have to help me on this, but the rappelling came from Europe, people climbing there. And who was the first Teton climber that came back and knew how to rappel? I think he did the first ascent of Owen.
Well, I think the people in the thirties were climbing Europe, like Underhill and Anderson.
Underhill, that's who I'm trying to think of.
They shared it with the locals, that's all.
Yeah.
So people
Well,
rappel. The, Randy was just mentioning the big rappel off the Grand. That, they used to have the fixed ropes down the old chimney and down around the double chimney and all that. And it was big town. We found what was now the big rappel that everybody uses. And that would be what, 47 or something, post-war.
So just to repeat, Dick Pownall was the one who found the big rappel that's used now, about 1944, did you say?
After the war.
After the war. Before that, there were fixed ropes on the chimney and people down climbing.
Wow.
And then it used to be that before harnesses, people did a body rappel where they wrapped the rope over the shoulder and around the back and through the legs. And to prevent getting burned, I think you have some stories of getting burned, don't you, Irene?
One of my first climbs in Yosemite Creek. One of my first climbs in Yosemite, we didn't make it down that night, and we had to, the next day we had to do what seemed like 20 rappels at the time, body rappels. And I remember standing in the shower, the water hitting, it was pretty uncomfortable.
But people would use a leather patch over their shoulders, or I know you showed that you stuff sweaters or things to try to prevent getting burned. So the gear is a lot better now. All right, maybe one last question, if anybody's got one. Yes?
What was it like taking risks in the mountain to kind of push your own boundaries and push the boundaries of what other women had done, and how you kind of manage that risk and rationalize it?
That's a great question, and since it's the last one, maybe everybody can answer it if you want to. So how did you take risks, and how did you approach taking risks and sort of pushing the boundaries of what women had been doing? You want to start, or should we start on the other?
Oh, go ahead.
We'll start.
I'm not a big risk taker, so.
Now I forgot the question. I kind of remember this. Well,
How did you approach taking risks and pushing the boundaries of what risks were normally taken by women? I think I'm sort of butchering your question, but is that kind of close?
Yeah, just, you know, it's just scary sometimes. Like, how do you manage doing that? Like, when you, like, one of the first people to do a route that you've never done before, and what was that like when the equipment was just very different from today? And
So kind of how did you manage your fear when you're approaching things that you've never done before? Maybe.
yeah.
I have to say I didn't really get scared. Over decades, there would be a moment when you realize you went a little too far, but and then you had to do it. But basically, I just felt like my experience was going to carry me through. We always learned, you know, back east, how to down climb what you went up. It just felt really comfortable being out on mountains and routes. It felt like I belonged there. And I kind of had a philosophy, because sometimes you get hail, lightnings, you know, could be coming in or something. But I kind of had a philosophy that I'm okay right now, this moment, and I just got to string another moment that I'm okay. And that's kind of how you do it. It's the same thing as taking one step at a time, I guess, and keep going. But I just felt enormously comfortable in the mountains.
Do you want to answer that?
No.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's difficult, I think, managing fear. I'm a chicken, but I also like pushing myself, so there's gotta be some happy medium there. One thing I've noticed guiding on the Grand is that the older I got, the more chicken I got, because I'd seen some actual badass stuff go down with lightning storms and people, you know, getting nearly fried. So I had a less of a risk tolerance, and I needed more of a kind of a safe envelope around the party as I got older. But personal climbing, it's tricky. I don't think I was very good at it. I didn't like doing a lot of first ascents for that reason.
She's really a chicken about talking in front of hundreds of people. Yeah, I love that idea, Bev, of just stringing those moments together. I'm okay right now. Get to the next piece. I'm okay now. I'm really okay now. Hanging out at this piece. I think it's, you know, 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 I think it's
quieting the mind big time. I finally read that book, The Rock Warrior's Way. If anybody hasn't read it yet, and even if you're not a climber, it's really great. Kind of revolutionary for my little squirrel mind. I have socks now that I wear with my climbing shoes that say, shh, I'm overthinking. So I try not to, that's my joke, and try not to overthink too much. And then I guess usually I'm having some sort of fun.
Type 3 fun?
2, 1. Depending on how good my snacks are.
Yeah. I kind of said what I said, but yeah, it's a good question. I guess you just one moment at a time and reading. If it's really scary, especially with the lighting. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I can answer that question either right now. Risk taking, acceptable risk. What is acceptable risk? Right, there's a film out there. Got the J Lake Ranger, about acceptable risk. No. That's it. Yeah, that's all for me.
This is kind of a different take on it, but in Peru, we were coming down off of Watson, I guess, and we had a fixed road down a very steep ice slope, which was over a cliff. And I was with all men, and they all went down this thing without a belay. And I didn't want to ask for a belay. So I started down, and about halfway down, when the steps stopped from going down to going sideways, I fell out of the steps. And all I had was a weak vanilla rope wrapped around my left arm a couple of times. And it was sure death if I had slipped any further. And so I think I learned there that if these things, you know, if the face was something I probably can't do or has a good chance I can't do, say so and ask for help.
Yeah. Any of you have any last words you want to say real quick?
No, just thank you, Kim. In the past week, I've had a lot of emails back and forth, and I met with Kim, and she has just put a ton of work into this.
Yeah. Everyone for agreeing to be on this panel. This is my honor. I hope everybody now has, if they didn't already, have a sense of what incredible women these are, what trailblazers, following the steps of people like Eleanor Davis. And thanks to all of you for coming. Come out to the other Centennial celebrations, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Hey, hi, it's a lady who, I climbed her dad.
Did you ever meet Margaret Stewart? They tried to play the entire background. They didn't get all the way up. You're very well behaved. Getting back to this before, she is somewhat of a family friend. She is very wealthy. Really the capital of Georgia, over the suburbs. But Teton is lived in Colorado Springs where I went to boarding school. Bob Owens was a teacher at the school, and he would invite Betsy to go playing. That's how I got to know her. You know, just several of times, and now it's very nice to do it too. She was from Minneapolis, with more publishing company. Anyway, awesome. She did a lot of good research. And she's here today with the internet. First help people to try to get them to talk to
That's right. I'm beyond that. What I just did. Did you do something on Marty? But she had that habit, Zolus's habit. When he died, would not accept, she would not accept she used to say, I'd love to see you. And I'll have some. And I don't know when you want to go back. Hey, Marty, and be there when you get cookies. I love that you said that.
I love the interaction with
Christian somebody. Right, yes. Up at the lower south. This is Laura.
Nice to meet you, Bev. You too. That was amazing. I loved hearing.
These are going really, really well, and that was amazing.
We should go.
Oh, yeah. Have a good night. Stop.